Good evening, everybody. My name's Melissa Guiney, and I am one of the registered dietitians here at Mind Body Wellness Center, and I'm also the registered dietitian for the Community Care Network with Meadville Medical Center. Tonight we are going to talk about food preservation and the different techniques that you can use to harvest your garden. We're going to talk about canning. That's one of the main ways to preserve your food. We're going to look at blanching and freezing, and then I have an example at the other end of drying foods. We're not going to do that tonight. We'll talk about it, okay? So let's talk a little bit about canning. Now, if you're new to canning, one of the things that you have to decide is what method of canning are you going to use. Are you going to use a hot water bath canning method or pressure canning method? How many of you know of the old wives' tales of pressure canners exploding, okay? And you're afraid of pressure canners for that reason, okay? That's valid, but keep in mind that pressure canners have been remodeled and re-engineered over the years, and typically any pressure canner that has been manufactured after 1970 has a lot of safety features built into it now that it is much, much safer. So we'll talk a little bit about the safety features of the canner, what to look for, how to work with it. Frankly, the only way that I have done my canning at home is with a pressure cooker. Okay, so we're going to talk first about the 5 rules of canning. The first one is know which canner to use. So that being said, basically a boiling water method canner is actually just a big pot. It's typically one that's been covered. It's a stainless steel pot, one that's been covered, and you usually have a basket that will fit down inside that holds your jars, and you fill it half full of water. You heat that water while you're getting your jars and everything ready, and so that your water is at temperature, at least 140 degrees, and the jars have to be covered by an inch or 2 of water when you are using a hot water bath canner. Okay? So that's one method. The other method is deciding whether or not you're going to use a pressure canner. Now, I started to heat my pressure canner just so that we could see and simulate like I would be canning my salsa tonight, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to take it home and do that. Whenever you take the lid off of a canner, because mine is hot, mine has a lid that slides and locks. Unlock, you will lift it away from you. See the steam escaping? You don't want that, the steam will burn you. When you are working with a pressure canner, one of the newer ones, they are much lighter weight than they were years and years and years ago. They have a plate inside that lifts the jars off of the bottom so that water will get underneath, another safety feature. There is also a gasket as a safety feature. Whenever you're working with a pressure canner, you always want to make sure that you are looking to be sure that this is not clogged. That is the pressure gauge, where the pressure gauge will sit. So you want to hold it up to the light, make sure that you can see through it before you put it on your pressure canner. And then you slide it in place. This is a pop-off pressure valve that, should this ever get clogged, it would allow the steam to escape. That's another safety feature. And then this is the pressure gauge. Once your pot has reached pressure, this will pop up, and that's when timing begins once you've put your jars inside. Okay? I'm going to turn this on because we're going to talk about when you put your jars inside, how to start timing it and what steps you have to take. Let me see if there's anything that we missed. Now, one of the ways to determine whether or not you use a pressure canner or a boiling pressure canner, the reason that we do it is because of, we want to be sure that there are no bacteria, no germs, in particular botulism. That is the reason that we have to be sure that we follow the steps correctly so that we don't run the risk of foodborne illness. So acidity of the food that is one way that determines whether you will use the pressure canner or the hot water bath canner. And acidity can be natural because most fruits are acidic, or that's added in. And I have examples here of ways to add it in. If you're pickling something, obviously you're using vinegar. Okay, that's a way to add acidity. If you're using citric acid, this is readily available this time of year. It's in the canning aisle right now. Another way to change acidity is with ascorbic acid, which is available all year round. Crush your vitamin C tablets and actually dissolve them, and you can adjust acidity that way. So that is something that is, this is pretty cheap. It was like $2. Vitamin C tablets available all year round. And you can also use lemon juice or lime juice. Some of the recipes that you're going to be processing or canning will have things added to them to adjust the acidity. So if you're developing your own recipes, or I want you to realize that if you want to be sure that you're adjusting the acidity so that the food will process properly. Because the botulinum, Clostridium botulinum, that's the name of the bacteria that produces the toxin botulism. And if it grows in an anaerobic where there's no oxygen, it will grow in that medium. It doesn't have any color, it doesn't have any odor, and you don't know that it's there. So that's where it's very important to make sure that you follow all the steps properly, and we're going to talk about what those are. Okay, any questions so far? No? Okay. Low acid foods have a pH value that are higher than 4.6. So that's most of your vegetables, except for tomatoes. Okay? Doesn't mean that you can't can them. It just means that it's going to determine which way you go for hot water bath or pressure canning. Low acid foods must be processed in a pressure canner to be botulism free. So those are going to be mostly your, some of your fruits, lemons, apricots, apples, cherries, grapes, tomatoes. Most of those are low acid foods. Okay? The high acid foods you can actually process in the hot water bath. And that's really the recommended method because it takes less time. Keeping in mind that when you are using the hot water bath canner, it typically takes about 25 minutes to 60 minutes to process those jars. Okay? That gives you about 25 to 30 minutes to get the water in the water bath up to temperature, and then once it's at a rolling boil, okay, that's when the timing starts. If you decide to do hot water bath canning, and you have to kind of watch and listen to be sure that you don't lose that boil. Should you lose the boil, you have to add water if that's the reason that you lost, because the water boiled down, and you start the timing over again. Okay? Did everybody get that? Okay? So that's how you know that you've processed the food properly. Okay? With a pressure canner, it would take 55 to 100 minutes to process foods that are a low or a high pH, like peaches, apples, peaches, pears, the other foods, the meats, things like that that people can. And you can see that I've had this on for quite a while, and nothing's happening, okay? And not only do I have to get this up to temperature, okay, but I have to let steam escape for 10 minutes because there's free air inside. So to get rid of all the free air that was put inside when I put the jars in, you let the steam escape and time it for 10 minutes. Then you add the pressure gauge, and that's what these are. This is 5 pounds, and each ring adds, these are weighted gauges. These add another 5 pounds. Okay, so we're up to 15 pounds pressure. Once the steam escapes, then you put this on, and then it will rock, and you don't time it until this pops all the way up, and that's when you start the timing of the pressure cooker. Does that make sense? Questions about that? So it takes quite a while to get the water inside up to temp. Let this 10 minutes, let the steam escape. Up, see, it's starting. So I would start to time my 10 minutes. After that, then we'll put the 5 pound pressure gauge on so that you can see it rock, and then that this will pop up. And then, once you've processed the jars and that you have in here, you can't do a quick release as you would if you were cooking. If any of you have the pressure canners that you cook with. Next month's cooking class will be on a little review of canning, but we're going to actually use a pressure cooker that will cook meals. I'm going to demonstrate using that. We're going to make creamy chicken curry with pasta, and it takes 8 minutes in a pressure cooker. So they're very, very different. But that's why I'm not going to process my jars tonight in front of you, because of the length of time, because those would have to be processed at so many pounds in the pressure. And keep in mind that pressure raises the temperature as much as to 240 degrees. And that's where we have any bacteria that will get killed at that temperature. Okay? All right. Let's see if I missed any pointers here. Rule. Choosing the right canner method or the right canner. And the difference has to do with the acidity of the food. The next rule of canning is choosing the right jar. Now, I brought in a few different jars. Obviously, these are the pint jars, okay? And these are the quart, okay? And be sure that you're using the right canning jar. They'll say Mason or Ball, or they're actual canning jars. Years and years ago, people would use mayonnaise jars or any kind of a jar that was close enough. And believe it or not, this fits. Okay, wrong kind of jar. The glass is too thin. and you run the risk of it breaking or the food will not process properly. Okay. They do make different jars. Some are wide mouth. I have an example. Wide mouth ring, wide mouth jar. A lot of times sauces, salsas, jellies, preserves, wide mouth. So just realize that whatever kind of food that you're looking to preserve, that you are going to get the right kind of jar. Jars last forever, so you can always reuse them. The rings, as long as they do not rust, can be reused. The only thing that you must use and get new every year are the lids. These are the regular mouth, which fit these jars, okay? And these are the wide mouth. And then typically your rings come in a box like this. Okay. All right. Questions about the jars or anything that we missed? Okay. The only other thing that I do want to say about the jars is make sure that you don't use vintage jars. If you have any vintage jars with the colored glass or the spring top lid, those are pretty to look at, but not good in this day and age to be using for canning. Save those jars to display your seashells or something pretty in them, but not for canning food. All right. When you are putting the lids on your produce and in your jars, the one thing to realize is that you have to, I'm going to put this on here. Okay, up. It popped right up. It's now at pressure, and if I had my jars inside, we could be timing them, and then once it's processed, you never ever quick release the steam. It must release the steam naturally itself. Okay? So you couldn't push that down or move this or remove it, because that's part of the processing process itself. Okay?
You don't have to wait until that jiggles?
It will start to jiggle. There's a certain amount of time. No, you have to time it. Usually your recipe will tell you. I have the old recipe book that came with my canner 30 years ago that tells you how many pounds, how long, okay? But most of your recipes will tell you that. The book that I have up here is a wonderful book. I collect cookbooks, so this is a great resource. It's Better Homes and Gardens Complete Canning Guide. So that will give you, it covers freezing, preserving, drying, blanching, canning. It gives you recipes. It's a great resource. Okay. Is that the one you have? Mm-hmm. So that's the one that I actually like. Now, the other thing to think about when you are canning, things have to be meticulously clean. Your jars should be sterilized. I don't go to the hassle of putting my jars in the pot and boiling them to sterilize them. I did boil the lids because you want to boil the lids so that the seal will soften and you'll get a better seal on your jar. I run my jars through the hot cycle of my dishwasher right before I'm ready to put the food in. So that is also a way that you can sanitize your jars. Your area needs to be as clean as possible so that you're not running the risk of contaminating that food. Okay? How do you know whether you should raw pack the food or hot pack the food. Okay? Which means, can you just pick it right out of the garden and put it right into the jar, which is raw pack, or do you have to cook it and then put it into the jars? Okay? And the way that you know that, it has to do with the raw packing being more suitable for vegetables that you're going to pressure can, which I kind of like that because that's one less step that I have to do. Another reason why I like to use the pressure canner over the hot water bath canner. You want to prepare your food. If you're going to do the hot packing method, you have to prepare the food to boiling, simmer it 2 to 5 minutes, and then start filling your jars with the boiled food. Whether the food has been hot packed or raw packed, though, you have to put either juice or syrup or water over the food. Have any of you canned before? Okay. So you know that when you are canning, when you add that liquid, sometimes if the food isn't packed in the jar properly, it'll float, or there'll be air. Okay. So when you look at my whole packed tomatoes, there's no floating going on, and there's no air. Okay. So that's one of the things, and the other important thing is remembering the headspace. To leave a space at the top, and it will specify that in your recipe how much room to leave at the top of your jars. Okay? Now, one of the tools that you want to have on hand, ruler. This is going to help you measure how much headspace. If your recipes specify cut or length or what have you, this is a great tool to have in the kitchen. Let's see if there's one other point about hot packing and raw packing. I don't see it right now. But depending on whether you use raw pack or hot packing method, keep in mind hot packing helps to remove the air from the food tissues, and it helps the food shrink. It's going to also help to keep the food from floating in the jars. Nothing's worse than you've packed it as tight as you think, and you have a pretty looking jar, and then when you pull it out of the canner, everything's up at the top. I hate that, because it doesn't, I could have put more food, or all the air went to the bottom. Okay, so that's, just to remember, hot packing helps remove the air from the food tissues, and it helps shrink the food so you can fit more in the jar, and it will prevent it, especially the fruit, it will prevent it from floating. And it isn't like you have to cook it for very long, 2 to 5 minutes, but again, that's one more step that you have to do to have your product turn out. All right. The fourth cooking method is choosing the right recipe. Make sure that you're looking at your recipes, that you're following them. The salsa that I made, I kind of followed a couple different recipes and then added my own things. But I did put in the batch of salsa that I made, almost 6 tablespoons of lime juice. So there is lime juice in here for acidity. Okay, we are going to kind of talk a little bit more here about some of the tools that you should have on hand for canning. A colander, okay? If you plan to make juice or anything like that, you would want to have cheesecloth. Line your strainer or your colander with that. that will, and put it over a bowl so that you will catch the juice. And that would be a way to strain the juice for processing. Obviously, measuring cups you need. Teaspoons, tablespoons for measuring. You'll need tongs. They do make other gadgets. I don't have them. But they have a gadget called a wand that has a magnetic end to it that will lift. Pardon me?
The best thing you have to have for cabin is that wand.
Well, that prevents you from burning your fingers if you want to get that magnetic wand. I don't have one of those. I use, so you like the magnetic wand that has a, yeah, exactly. But tongs will work. That's what I used today when I did that. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is to, once you put the food in, you want to get all the air bubbles out. You can use a spatula, but chopsticks work really, really well. I just kind of went around, and you could see where the air bubbles were in my jar, and I'll demonstrate when I load this jar, but I just used the chopstick, and I'll tell you what, works slick as anything. Okay. Nice to have an 8-cup measure, because this is great for measuring chopped vegetables. It's great for measuring your liquids if you have to make a light syrup or boiling water or what have you for your jars. Okay? Plus it makes a great mixing bowl too. Jar lifters. You will want to have these because once your jars and the pressure has gone down in your pressure canner or your water bath canner has cooled, you need to be lifting the jars out. This is a great tool for that. And then you set them on a wire rack to cool. And they must cool for 12 to 24 hours. And when you take them out, you do not mess with the rings that are on the jar. You just take them out and set them. Now, these jars have not been processed, and how do you know if a jar has sealed? You will hear this noise. Let's see if we catch it. Can you hear that? This one hasn't been processed, it isn't sealed, and it makes a popping noise. Okay? This has been sealed. There's no popping noise. And there's nothing greater that I like to hear than pop, that you know that jar has completely sealed. Have I had jars that don't seal? Every now and then, absolutely. But typically, my jars are all like that. Don't have any problem. Okay? When you are done and everything's cooled and the jars are sealed, you would remove the ring, clean this very, very well, make sure that you label it, date it. Typically, rule of thumb is don't plan to preserve more food than what you would use in a year. Typically, there's nothing wrong with that. With the food. If it's longer than that, it just means that quality-wise, food quality-wise, you want to be using up what you would can or preserve within a year. Okay? Now, we talked about it already. Keep it clean, keep it hot. Okay? So we talked about making sure that everything is as clean as possible, sterilizing your jars, hot food into hot jars, doing one jar at a time. Don't set up an assembly line and allow those jars to cool down if you're doing that hot packing method. One jar, put food in it. Next jar, put food in it. Okay? One other interesting fact that I want to mention about canning is altitude. Keep in mind that every when we are above sea level, okay, and I did Google how far above sea level is Mind Body Wellness Center, okay? And Mind Body Wellness Center is 1,148 feet above sea level. Why that's important is because at sea level, water boils at 212 degrees. When you are above sea level, water boils at a lower temperature. Therefore, that affects your processing time, and it affects your pressure for your pressure canner, and it affects the length of time you process in a hot water bath canner. So keep that in mind. I do have a website that you can visit and get for your address what is your elevation above sea level, so that then you will know, do you add, and there's a chart. Typically most pressure or most canning books will give you a chart, but the website, for those of you that would like it, is veloroutes.org, and then /elevation. And it brings up the site, you plug in your address, it pinpoints your longitude and latitude right on the map and tells you how many feet above sea level you are. So that's real important, because remember, if you don't process your food long enough, you run the risk that for foodborne illness, potential for foodborne illness, I should say. Okay? Questions? All right, let me fill this jar just to demonstrate that, and then we'll move on.
One caution, when you're putting your jars in your water, make sure the water is not too hot.
Oh, absolutely.
Cold jar.
Yes, absolutely. Your water and your jars, they can't be, these are cold, but by the time I get home this evening, they'll be warm enough that I can put them in the canner. Now, I have turned this off, and you'll see I can't do anything with this until this pressure vent falls on its own, and that's when the process of canning has actually been completed, that then I would lift the lid off this way towards myself so that I don't get burned with any steam, let the jars sit in the canner and cool for 10 minutes before I lift them out and put them on the wire rack for safety reasons. You don't want to take them from a high temperature. Figure, they're 240 degrees. You've got to let them start cooling down and then moving them. You don't want all your work to go for naught and run the risk that the jars would break. Okay? All right, so this is salsa that I put together. One other nice piece of equipment that you want to have, a jar funnel. This was my mother's. Today they're plastic. This one is porcelain. You can see that it's been used and it's rather old. So we're going to fill the jar. So we ladle it in. And keep in mind, I'm going to pressure cook so I can cold pack this product. Typically, when I'm canning, I am usually doing tomatoes, and I don't usually can other items. So that's one less step. Okay, perfect. So I'm not having to cook my food before. Set this over here, out of the way. And for salsa, you're going to want to leave about a 1/2 inch. So that's about a 1/2 inch. And to get the air bubbles out, I'm going to take my trusty chopstick, and you can see there are air bubbles here in the jar, and you run the chopstick around to get those air bubbles out. Very simple. Works like a charm. You can use a spatula, but you do want to get those air bubbles out. Oh, missed a couple over here. Okay. The next thing that you definitely need to do is clean, wet wash or clean, wet rag, and you always wipe the rim of the jar thoroughly, because if there's any food or anything on that rim, you run the risk that it won't seal properly. Okay. This would be taken out of the hot water, where you would use that magic wand or tongs to take it out, and you make sure that it's on, hold it in place, and put your ring on. And you only tighten it tight enough that it doesn't go too tight. You can loosen it, because if you tighten it too tight, you run the risk that it will break. So very loosely, it's snug, it's there. And it's ready. It's that simple. Okay? All right. We are going to talk about freezing. And I want to show this to you as well. This is a great gadget. If you're making bread and butter pickles or really anything that you want to slice, or a relish, or anything that you are slicing, this is a mandolin slicer. And I'll tell you what, slicing onions and pickling cucumbers for making bread and butter pickles, it is fast. So a good investment, something to think about. So that is what that gadget is. Okay? Makes it a whole lot easier. Now, blanching typically involves pots of water boiling on the stove and then an ice water bath to plunge the vegetables in. When do we do canning and freezing most of the time? It's done in the middle of summer when it's hotter than anything outside. It's hot, it's humid. I don't like to use that water on the stove method. I do my blanching in the microwave. So this is a great cookbook. This is a microwave cookbook. And in here is a section on blanching that pretty much you can blanch most vegetables in the microwave. And then you plunge them in an ice water bath and you freeze them. So very simple. Another tool that you might want to consider is a food scale. This is 1 pound of green beans. So say you've picked your green beans from the garden, okay, and I brought them in, I've washed them, and I need to take the ends off and cut them, and I weigh out 1 pound. And I do 1 pound at a time, because that's all I'm going to be packing in my bags. What's the difference between a freezer bag and a food storage bag? Okay? Exactly, it's the weight of the plastic. Now, freezer bags are much heavier, thicker plastic, and it's to prevent freezer burns. So be sure that you don't accidentally pick up the wrong bag, because they do look the same. And when you're in the store and you grab it and you get it home, you go, oh, I put everything in a food storage bag. Now what? Okay? It just means that you run the risk that it's not going to be able to withstand the temperatures of the freezer. Typically, freezers are at 0 and below to hold your food. Okay, so we're going to go ahead. Now this is 1 pound of green beans that I have already cleaned and sliced, and they're weighed out, they're ready. I'm putting it in a casserole. Usually it's about a 1.5 quart casserole. Put those in here. You add 1/2 cup of water. You can cover it and vent it with plastic or put the lid on, and we're going to put it in the microwave. And it's usually 3.5 to 5 minutes. And that's what we're going to do. Now, I'm going to get the ice water bath out to show you how to stop the cooking process. Typically at home I just use the sink, but for all purposes tonight we're going to actually use the bowl with ice in it. So once that's cooked, then we will drain it in a sieve that looks like this. So make sure not only do you need a colander, but large sieves. I have ones that are usually on a handle, but these are kind of handy to have as well. And you will drain those off when they're done. Always keep plenty of pot holders available because those are going to be hot when we pull them out. Okay. Oh, look at that. It finally fell. That means the processing is done. So we gently lift this off. We unlock the lid and we lift it this way. And you can see all of the steam that comes out. And we would leave the lid off then and wait 10 minutes before we lift our jars out to cool completely for the next 12 to 24 hours. And you don't touch those jars once you've set them on there. Don't mess with the lid, don't touch the jars. Let them cool naturally so that they seal, and you'll listen for that pop. Okay. The last thing that we're going to talk about is if you don't have a food dehydrator and you want to dry food, I would probably recommend that if you have a strong desire to dry food, the oven method really isn't the way to do that in this day and age. I did do it though. I did dry bananas. These are bananas that have been processed and treated. You can see that they have added sugar. They have some other things that are added to them. I bought these on this side. These are the ones that I dried. These are just bananas themselves, but it took me 10 hours to dry them. So it is a very lengthy process. Most of your ovens may not go low enough to dry fruit or vegetables or herbs. So think about that dehydrator. It can be done. My oven doesn't go low enough. So I ended up using my toaster oven, believe it or not. My toaster oven goes very, very low. But again, it took 10 hours to dry bananas just to see. Now there's nothing wrong with them, they're great. I can throw them in cereal, I can throw them in trail mix, what have you. They taste just like a banana. There's no additives, no preservatives. But if you try to dry food at too high of a temperature and don't do it with the idea it's a very low, slow temperature of about 135, you cook the food instead of dry it. So that's the main thing there. All right, our beans are done. So what we do, we pull them out, lift the lid, we're going to drain them. You can see how pretty green they are. Okay. And we plunge them right into the ice water to stop the cooking process. Okay. And once we've left them in there a little bit, we'll take them out, make sure that they're really good and drained. Make sure they all get covered. And then you want to have clean towels to dry it. So we will be using clean kitchen towels to dry it before we package it in our bag. Folding it up, going like that to get most of the water out before we package it into the storage bags. Much easier than the pots on the stove, and because that's a lot. I mean, I used to do it that way, and then I was like, let's try this. No mess, no heat, your kitchen stays cool. I've already weighed it out. I know it's a pound. It's going to fit in my bag. And, you know, this is the time of the year. Beans are coming, and you just have everything. You feel like you're in the kitchen. That's all you do. But this is a way to stay cool and still process your produce, because nothing tastes better than produce that you have grown yourself or gotten at the farmer's market, and it's much easier. And it's, you know, I used to pick beans a little at a time, so there you go, already in. Make sure that we get as much air out as possible, and we seal it. And we're done. 1 pound of beans ready to go. Label and date, and into the freezer it goes. Okay? Questions?
I have never heard of doing the blanching in the microwave. That's something really new.
Yeah, blanching in the microwave, it makes it so much easier.
Yeah.
You have really no mess other than, you know, washing this. You have your casserole, a colander. That's about it.
If you're going to dry foods, don't mess around with the cheap dry dehydrators from Walmart's and theirs. Go for the Excalibur.
Okay, that's a good.
I think
yeah.
I tried 3 of the cheap ones.
A food dehydrator. Make sure that if you're going to do it, that you get a good quality one.
Great.
Right. Right, and I would agree with that. I mean, if you're going to do it, because your dehydrator is going to last. But again, if you're adventuresome and you really want to dry food and fruits and things, you know, it can be done. And I do have a handout, but it takes, blueberries can take 10 to 20 hours. Strawberries, 6 to 16 hours. And you have to be sure that they are dry and that they're not sticky or, and because otherwise they aren't going to be preserved. If there's any moisture left in the food at all, it will mold and it won't be preserved. So again, it's that length of time. My husband said, for all the effort that I put into doing this, he said, really? He said, it's just easier, just go buy it. I was like, well, I wanted to prove that I could do it. Okay, so there you have it. Those are the ones, obviously, that I did. There's no additives, no preservatives. These are the ones that are actually coated with a sugar solution that you would actually buy at the store. Okay, so that's the difference. And again,
basically did apples most of the time for dried apple slices.
Right, dried apple slices.
And it doesn't take them that long in the Excalibur.
Okay.
Strawberries I've done, but you slice them very thin. It's just
Right,
a little
and that
piece of
is
paper when you're done.
that is one of the keys. It will tell you the thickness to slice your fruit, because thinner is better. And I had a hard time. These are only 1/4 of an inch thick for the bananas. So yeah, I had my measuring stick out, making sure that my slices weren't too thick, because they weren't going to dry. And even again, it still took 10 hours. I was like, holy cow. Okay.
And peach, make puree.
Okay, peach puree.
And, applesauce.
Okay.
Like the fruit leather.
Okay.
That turns out.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. Fruit leather.
Yeah.
Okay.
Kids really like it.
Right, right. Same thing as a fruit roll-up.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now I do have handouts for those of you that are interested. This is a food preservation quick reference chart. This is going to tell you, for canning purposes, whether you use hot or raw pack. We talked about hot packing and raw packing. The jar size, how much headspace to leave at the top of the jar, and then the processing time. Okay, and then the gauge, or I don't have a dial gauge on my pressure canner. The dial gauge, if you happen to have a dial gauge pressure canner, that has to be checked every year and adjusted to be sure that it's accurate. Mine is a weighted gauge. So I have the weights, which the only thing I have to do is make sure that that stem is not blocked, and I'm good to go. And that my gasket's where it belongs and everything like that, but I don't have to calibrate that dial to be sure that it's accurate. So keep that in mind. If you have your book that came and you have a dial pressure canner, you need to know how to calibrate that gauge so that it's accurate. Okay? But I do have that, and it goes through all of the different foods. I did make a guide to freezing produce for everybody, and this goes through the produce itself, how to prepare it, how long do you blanch it, and then cooking time, bringing it from frozen, how long do you cook it, okay? So that goes through everything. There's 4 pages. And then last but not least, how do you oven dry fruit? For those of you that have that strong desire to do it. I did it, and I thoroughly have to say, nah, I'm not going to do it again. Okay. Questions? Does anybody? Yes, ma'am.
Does it hurt to vacuum seal your vegetables to freeze them?
No.
Okay.
She asked, does it hurt to vacuum seal your vegetables to freeze them? No, it does not. It does not. Usually folks want to know about adding salt when you can, adding sugar when you can. It is not necessary to add salt to your vegetables when you can. That is only done for flavor. So it is a great way to make your own homemade canned, no salt added vegetables. Anything that I can and I process is not done with any salt. When you make your sugar solution for your fruit, you could use Splenda or stevia, one of the artificial sweeteners that doesn't denature with heat, and make your syrup or your solution to go over your fruit using the Splenda, or pack it in water. You do not have to add sugar or salt. That's not necessary. Okay?
Back before we had freezers, my mom used to can corn.
Yes, canned corn.
You have to cook it like 3 hours.
Yes.
And they used to put a slice of tomato on the top of the corn, and that was your acidic.
Okay, that's an interesting thought. I wouldn't think to do that.
That was long ago.
I was going to say, things are a lot different now.
Yeah.
And
I
they're,
remember Mom doing that.
yeah, I know my mom, we always froze our corn. But I always got the packet, I didn't get to take it off the cob. It's a lot of work. It was a family affair, typically. Yeah.
With the chopstick and the bubbles,
Yes.
are all the bubbles around the edge on the glass, or are there bubbles in the middle too?
Well, typically, you're looking to see, I'm only looking for the bubbles around the edge, and that's where you run, because typically when you're canning and you're packing your jars, you're looking to see, are there bubbles around the edge? So you run that spatula or the chopstick around the edge of the jar. And I don't see any bubbles now that I have done that in any of my jars. So just a, you know,
I always used a table knife.
right, a table knife, something that's going to be very sturdy and not have a lot of give. So some of your spatulas that you have at home may be very stiff, and make good use of that. There was not one here. I have one at home, but I brought my chopsticks in to show, you know what, you don't have to go buy all of the equipment. If you chopsticks, a butter knife, something that will get in there without getting too much of a mess. As I'm all about not making a mess, not having a lot of stuff to clean up afterwards, trying to, again, keep things clean, sanitary, neat, so that your jars are ready to go right into the canner. Okay. Anybody have any other questions? Okay. If you're interested, like I said, next month's cooking class is on pressure cooking, but making food with the pressure cooker. We will revisit some of the canning. We'll be sampling salsa, and I think I'm actually going to make homemade tortillas. So we'll have tortilla chips to sample the salsa with, and we will be enjoying creamy chicken curry and pasta that will have been prepared in the pressure cooker. Okay? All right? Thanks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.